Sal was first, still a tiny Pomeranian. He yipped nervously, giving Linus a wide berth before jumping up on Mr. Parnassus, tail wagging. "Hello, Sal," Mr. Parnassus said, looking down. Then, remarkably, he barked a high-pitched yip. Sal responded in kind, with a series of barks before taking off toward the house. "You brought a cat?" Linus gaped at him. "You can speak to Sal?" Mr. Parnassus asked. "Of course I can. He's one of mine. It's important to... Talia, thank you for showing our guest around the grounds. That was very kind of you. And Chauncey, I doubt there's been a better bellhop in all the world." "Really?" Chauncey warbled, eyes swaying on his stalks. "The entire world?" He puffed out his chest. Or rather, he appeared to puff out his chest. Linus couldn't be sure he had a chest at all. "Did you hear that, Talia? The entire world!" Talia snorted. "I heard. You'll have your own hotel before you know it." She glanced up at Linus as she stroked her beard. "You're welcome for not braining you with the shovel when I had the chance." She winced slightly when Mr. Parnassus spoke in a low, guttural sound, almost as if he were choking. It took a moment for Linus to realize he was speaking gnomish. Talia heaved a great dramatic sigh. "Sorry, Mr. Baker. I promise I won't brain you with my shovel. Today." And with that, she and Chauncey went down the stairs and headed toward the main house. Linus felt a cold chill race down his spine when he heard the floor creak behind him. Lucy appeared beside them, smiling maniacally up at Linus. He didn't appear to blink. "Yes?" Linus asked in a croak. Can I help you?" "No," Lucy said, smile widening. "You can't. Nobody can. I am the father of snakes. The void in the—" "That's enough of that," Mr. Parnassus said lightly. "Lucy, it's your turn to help Miss Chapelwhite in the kitchen. You're already late. Hop to it." Lucy sighed as he deflated. "Aw, seriously?" "Seriously," Mr. Parnassus said, reaching down and patting him on the shoulder. "Get a move on. You know she doesn't like it when you shirk your responsibilities." Lucy grumbled under his breath as he hopped down the stairs. He glanced back over his shoulder at Linus when he reached the bottom. Linus felt his knees wobble. "He's bluffing," Mr. Parnassus said. "He actually loves working in the kitchen. I think he's just putting on a show for you. Quite the little entertainer he is." "I think I need to sit down," Linus said, feeling numb. "Of course," Mr. Parnassus said easily. "You've had a long day." He glanced at his wrist, pulling back the sleeve of his coat to reveal a large watch. "Dinner is at 7:30, so you have a bit to get settled. Miss Chapelwhite has prepared a feast in your honor as a welcome to Marcius. I'm told there will be pie for dessert. I do love pie so." He took Linus's hand in his own again, squeezing gently. Linus looked up at him. "I know why you're here," he said quietly. "And I know the power you wield. All I ask is that you keep an open mind, Mr. Baker. Can you do that for me?" Linus pulled his hand away, feeling off-kilter. "I will do what I must." Mr. Parnassus nodded. He looked as if he were going to say something else, but instead shook his head. He turned and stepped off the porch, following his charges into the dark. He didn't look back. Linus barely remembered walking down the hall toward his bedroom. He felt as if he were caught in a strange dream, one he didn't know how to escape from. The sensation persisted as he passed the tiny bathroom, only to see his toiletries had been placed on a shelf underneath the mirror. "What?" he asked, no one in particular. The bedroom at the end of the hall was small but functional. There was a desk facing the window that opened out to the cliff, overlooking the sea. A chair was pressed against it. Near what appeared to be a closet door was a small bureau. A bed with an oversized quilt sat against the opposite wall. Calliope was on the pillow, tail curled around her. She opened a single eye as he entered, tracking his movement. He opened his mouth and was about to speak to her when the words stuck in his throat. His suitcase sat on the bed, opened and empty. He rushed toward it. "Where are my things?" Calliope yawned and tucked her face in her paws, breathing deeply. The files for the children and Mr. Parnassus were still secure in a side pocket, the zipper closed. They didn't appear to have been trifled with, but his clothes were gone, and so was... He looked around wildly. There, on the floor, near the desk, sat Calliope's bowls. One had been filled with water, and the other with her kibble, the bag of which was placed to the side of the desk. On top of the desk was his copy of Rules and Regulations. He went to the closet and threw open the doors. His shirts and ties and slacks were hung carefully from the hangers. Next to them was the one coat he'd brought, though he hadn't been sure he'd need it. His spare loafers were sitting on the floor. Leaving the door open, he went to the bureau. Inside, stacked neatly, were his socks and undergarments. The next drawer down held his pajamas and the only non-work clothes he'd brought, pants and a polo shirt. He backed away from the bureau, slowly, until his legs hit the edge of the bed. He sat down roughly, staring at the drawers in the open closet. "I think," he said to Calliope, "that I'm in over my head." She didn't have an opinion one way or another. Shaking his head, he reached for his suitcase, pulling the files out and onto his lap. "Foolish," he muttered. "Next time, know what you're walking into." He took a deep breath before opening the file on top. "Oh," he said rather breathlessly when he read about a wyvern named Theodore. "What?" he choked out when he opened the file for a 14-year-old boy called Sal. He didn't manage to say anything at all for Talia, though a bead of sweat trickled down his brow. He was right about Fee, a forest sprite, and a powerful one at that. He recoiled sharply at what he saw for a boy called Chauncey. He was 10 years old, and next to the word mother, it read unknown. The same for his father, and his species. It appeared no one seemed to know exactly what Chauncey actually was, and now that Linus had seen him in person, he wasn't sure either. Extremely upper management was right. The children weren't like anything he'd ever seen before. He gave very real consideration to ignoring the dinner invitation and pulling the heavy quilt up and over his head, blocking out the strange world he'd found himself in. Maybe if he slept, things would make more sense upon waking. But then his stomach grumbled and Linus realized he was hungry. Ravenous, even. He poked his not inconsiderable stomach. "Must you?" It gurgled again. He sighed, which is why he found himself standing at the front door to the main house, steeling his nerves. "It's no different than any other assignment," he muttered to himself. "You've been in this situation before. On with it, old boy, you've got this." He reached up and banged the metal knocker against the door 3 times, and waited. A minute later, he knocked again. Still no response. He wiped the sweat from his brow as he stepped back, looking at the side of the house. There were lights on through the windows, but it didn't appear anyone was coming to the door. He shook his head as he stepped again to the door. After a moment of indecision, he reached for the knob. It turned easily under his hand and he pushed. The door opened. Inside was a foyer that led to a wide set of stairs to the second floor. The banisters were wooden and smooth. A large chandelier hung above the foyer, the crystals glittering in the light. He stuck his head through the doorway, listening. He heard music. It was faint, but still. He couldn't make out the song, but it felt familiar somehow. "Hello?" he called. No one answered. He stepped into the house, closing the door behind him. To his right was a living room, a large, overstuffed couch set in front of a dark fireplace. There was a painting above the fireplace, a whimsical portrait of swirling eddies. He thought he saw the ruffled skirt of the couch shift, but he couldn't be sure it wasn't just a trick of the low light. Ahead were the stairs. To his left was a formal dining room, though it didn't appear to be in use. The smaller chandelier above the table was dark, and the table was covered with books, old by the looks of them. "Hello?" He tried again. No one responded. He did the only thing he could. He followed the sound of the music. The closer he got, the more the notes filled in, trumpets low and sharp. A sweet, masculine voice singing that somewhere beyond the sea, She's there, watching for me. Linus had this record. He loved it so. As Bobby Darin sang about watching ships from golden sands, Linus moved through the dream, fingers tracing along the books on the table. He barely glanced down at the titles, entranced by the telltale scratch of a record spinning. He came to 2 swinging doors, portholes in their center. He stood on his tiptoes, peering through them. The kitchen was bright and airy. It was bigger than any kitchen he'd ever seen before. He was sure the entire guest house could fit inside, with room to spare. Lights hung from the ceiling, surrounded by glass globes like fish bowls. He could see a gigantic refrigerator next to an industrial-sized oven. The granite counters were sparkling clean, and his jaw dropped. Miss Chapelwhite was moving through the kitchen, feet barely touching the floor. Her wings glittered behind her, much brighter than Fee's had been. They fluttered with every step she took. But it was the other person in the kitchen that caught Linus's eye the most. Lucy was standing on a step stool in front of the counter. He had a plastic knife in his hand and was chopping a tomato, dropping the pieces into a large pink bowl to his left. And he was bouncing along with Bobby Darin. As the orchestra swelled mid-song, drums beating, trumpets blaring, he shook his entire body in time with the music. Bobby came back in, saying he knew without a doubt his heart would lead him there. And Lucy was rocking his head back, bellowing the words as he danced. Ms. Chapelwhite was singing along with him, twirling in the kitchen as she moved in and out of sight. It was a feeling of unreality that washed over Linus then, a discordant wave that felt like it was sucking him down. He couldn't catch his breath. "What are you doing?" a voice whispered. Linus let out a strangled yelp and turned to find Fee and Talia standing behind him. Fee had cleaned herself up, her red hair like fire, her freckles more pronounced. Her wings were folded against her back. Talia had changed into a different outfit, though it was remarkably similar to the one she'd been wearing before. Sans cap. Her long, white hair hung down on her shoulders, the same luxuriant color as her beard. They both stared up at him suspiciously. Linus didn't know what to say. "I'm spying?" Fee suggested. He stiffened. "Absolutely not."
"We don't like spies here,"
Talia said ominously.
"The last spy who tried to infiltrate our house was never heard from again."
She leaned forward, eyes narrowing.
"Because we cooked him and ate him for supper."
"You did no such thing," Mr. Parnassus said, appearing out of nowhere. Linus was beginning to understand it was something he did. At some point, he'd removed his coat. He now wore a thick sweater, the ends of which fell over the backs of his hands. "Because we've never been so lucky as to have a spy. A spy suggests someone capable of infiltration without displaying their intent. Anyone that has come here has made their intentions perfectly clear. Isn't that right, Mr. Baker?" "Yes," he said. "Quite." Mr. Parnassus smiled. "And besides, we don't harm our guests. Certainly not to the point of murder. That would be rude." That didn't make Linus feel any better. Beyond the Sea gave way to Bobby singing about wanting a girl to call his own so he wouldn't have to dream alone. "Shall we?" Mr. Parnassus asked. Linus nodded. They all stared at him. It took him a moment to realize he was blocking the door. He stepped aside. Fee and Talia pushed through to the kitchen. Mr. Parnassus called over his shoulder, "Theodore, supper!" Linus heard a loud scuffling coming from the living room. He looked beyond Mr. Parnassus in time to see Theodore burst out from underneath the couch, tripping over his wings. He growled as he flipped end over end, tail smacking against the floor. He lay on his back for a moment, breathing heavily. "Slow and steady, Theodore," Mr. Parnassus said kindly. "We'd never start without you." Theodore sighed. Possibly, Linus couldn't be sure, and righted himself. He chirped as he gingerly stood on his back legs, folding his wings behind him with great care, first the right and then the left. He took a tentative step forward, claws sliding on the wood floor before he found a grip. "He prefers to fly everywhere," Mr. Parnassus whispered to Linus. "But whenever it's time to eat, I ask him to walk." "Why?" "Because he must get used to his feet on the ground. He can't spend all his time on wings. He'll tire, especially being so young. If he ever finds himself in danger, he needs to learn to use his legs as well as his wings. Linus was startled. Danger? Why would he? How many wyverns are left in the world, Mr. Baker? That shut Linus up quickly. The answer, though he couldn't be exact, was not many. Mr. Parnassus nodded. Precisely. Theodore took his exaggerated steps toward them, head cocked to the side. When he stood at their feet, he looked up at Mr. Parnassus, chirped, and spread his wings. Yes, yes, Mr. Parnassus said, leaning down to run a finger along his snout. Very impressive. I'm proud of you, Theodore. He folded his wings again, then looked up at Linus before leaning down and biting gently on the tip of one of his loafers. Mr. Parnassus looked at him expectantly. Linus wasn't sure what for. He's saying thank you for the button. Linus would prefer not being gnawed on to show gratitude, but it was already too late for that. Oh, well, you're welcome? Theodore chirped again and went through the door that Mr. Parnassus held open for him. Shall we? He asked Linus. Linus nodded and walked through the door into the kitchen. There was another table set at the other end of the kitchen. This one looked more used than the one in the formal dining room. There was a slightly worn tablecloth spread out, weighted down by place settings. 3 plates and sets of silverware were on one side. There were 4 place settings on the other side, though one didn't have a spoon or a fork, and there were settings at either end of the table. Candles were lit and flickering. In the center, there was food stacked high. He saw scalloped potatoes and bread and some sort of meat he couldn't recognize. There were leafy greens. The tomatoes that Lucy had been chopping looked like red beetles in the candlelight. A feast, he'd been told, in his honor. Linus wondered if it were poisoned. Most of the children were already sitting at the table. Chauncey sat in the middle, with Fee and Talia on either side of him. Across from them were Theodore, climbing on the chair in front of the plate with no forks or spoons, and Miss Chapelwhite. Next to her was an empty chair, and then Sal. He glanced back at Linus, found he was being watched, and then turned around quickly, lowering his head, picking at the tablecloth. Mr. Parnassus sat at one end of the table. That left the other end as the only open seat, seeing as how Linus was most likely not going to sit next to Sal. The poor boy probably wouldn't eat a single bite if that were the case. No one spoke as he approached. He pulled out the chair, the legs of which scraped against the floor. He winced, cleared his throat, and sat. He wished Bobby were still singing to distract from the awkwardness, but he couldn't see a record player anywhere. He unfolded his cloth napkin next to his plate and spread it over his lap. Everyone stared at him. He fidgeted in his chair. Lucy was suddenly there beside him, causing Linus to jump in his seat. "Oh dear," he said. "Mr. Baker," Lucy said sweetly, "can I get you something to drink? Juice, perhaps? Tea?" He leaned forward and dropped his voice. "The blood of a baby born in a cemetery under a full moon?" "Lucy!" Mr. Parnassus warned. Lucy stared at Linus. "Whatever you want, I can give you," he whispered. Linus coughed weakly. Water is fine." "One water, coming right up." He reached up, grabbing an empty glass set next to Linus's plate. He took it to the sink, climbing up onto his stool. He stuck his tongue out in concentration through the gap where his 2 front teeth used to be as he turned on the tap. Once the glass was full, he held it with both hands as he climbed down from his stool. He spilled nary a drop as he handed it over to Linus. "There," he said. "You're welcome. And I'm not even thinking about banishing your soul to eternal damnation or anything." "Thank you," Linus managed to say. "That's very kind of you." Lucy laughed, a sound Linus was sure would haunt him for the rest of his life, before he went to the remaining empty chair. Sal pulled it out for him. On the chair sat a booster seat. Lucy climbed up into it, and Sal pushed the chair back toward the table, keeping his gaze downcast. Mr. Parnassus smiled at the children. "Wonderful. As you are all aware, even though someone decided to hide his arrival from me, we have a guest." Lucy sank down in his booster seat just a little. Mr. Baker is here to make sure you're all healthy and happy, Mr. Parnassus continued. I ask that you treat him as you would me or Miss Chapelwhite, which means with respect. If I find out that any of you have done anything untoward, there will be a loss of privileges. Are we clear? The children nodded, including Theodore. Good, Mr. Parnassus said, smiling quietly. Now, before we eat, one thing you learned today. Fee? I learned how to make the foliage thicker, Fee said. It took a lot of concentrating, but I did it. Wonderful. I knew you could do it. Chauncey? His eyeballs knocked together. I can unpack suitcases all by myself, and I got a tip. How impressive. I doubt a suitcase has ever been unpacked as well as you did. Talia, if you please. Talia stroked her beard.
If I stand really still, strange men think I'm a statue.
Linus choked on his tongue. Illuminating, Mr. Parnassus said, a twinkle in his eye. Theodore? He chirped and growled, head resting on the tabletop. Everyone laughed. Except for Linus, that is, because he wasn't sure what had happened. He learned that buttons are the best things in the world, Miss Chapelwhite said to Linus, glancing fondly down at Theodore. And I learned that I still judge people by their appearance, though I should know better. Linus understood who that was intended toward. He thought that was as close to an apology as he'd ever get from her. Sometimes, Mr. Parnassus said, our prejudices color our thoughts when we least expect them to. If we can recognize that and learn from it, we can become better people. Lucy? Linus felt parched. He picked up his glass of water. Lucy looked toward the ceiling and, in a monotone voice, said, I learned that I am the bringer of death and destroyer of worlds. Linus sprayed water on the table in front of him. Everyone turned slowly to stare at him again. Apologies, he said quickly. He took the napkin from his lap and wiped down his plate. Went down the wrong pipe. Indeed, Mr. Parnassus said. Almost like it was planned that way. Lucy, should we try one more time? Lucy sighed. I learned once again that I'm not just the sum of my parts. Of course not. You're more. Sal? Sal glanced at Linus, then turned his gaze downward. His lips moved, but Linus couldn't make out what he was saying. Neither could Mr. Parnassus, or so it seemed. Louder, please, so we can hear you. Sal's shoulders slumped. I learned that I still get scared of people I don't know. Mr. Parnassus reached out and squeezed his arm. And that's okay, because even the bravest of us can still be afraid sometimes, so long as we don't let our fear become all we know. Sal nodded, but didn't look back up. Mr. Parnassus sat back in his chair, looking across the table at Linus. As for me, I learned that gifts come in all shapes and sizes, and when we expect them the least. Mr. Baker, what is it you've learned today? Linus shifted in his seat. Oh, I don't think I should. I'm here to observe. It wouldn't be proper for me to... Please, Mr. Baker, Chauncey said wetly, tentacle creeping along on the table, suckers sticking to the tablecloth and causing it to bunch up. You just have to. Yes, Mr. Baker, Lucy said in that same dead voice. You absolutely have to. I'd hate to think what would happen if you didn't. Why, it might bring about a plague of locusts. You wouldn't want that, would you? Linus felt the blood rush from his face. Children, Mr. Parnassus said as Miss Chapelwhite covered up a smile. Let him speak. And Lucy, we talked about the locust plague. That's only to be done under direct supervision. Mr. Baker? They looked at him expectantly. It seemed as if he wasn't going to get out of this. He said the first thing that came to his mind. I learned that there are things in this world that defy the imagination.
Things?
Talia said, eyes narrowing.
And what would these things be?
The ocean, Linus said quickly. Yes, the ocean. I've never seen it before, and I've always wanted to. It's vaster than I even realized.
Oh,
Talia said.
That's So boring. Can we eat now? I'm starving.
Yes, Mr. Parnassus said, never looking away from Linus. Of course. You've earned it. As strange as the situation Linus found himself in was, dinner went relatively smoothly for the first 10 minutes. It was while he was picking at the salad on his plate, not responding to the call of the potatoes no matter how loud it was, that it came to a screeching halt. It started, of course, with Talia.
Mr. Baker,
She asked innocently.
wouldn't you like something more than just the salad?
No, he said. Thank you, I'm quite fine. She hummed under her breath.
You sure? A man of your size can't live on rabbit food alone.
Talia, Mr. Parnassus said. Leave Mr. Baker. It's because of my size, Linus interjected, not wanting someone to speak for him again. He was in charge here, after all, and the sooner they knew that, the better.
What's wrong with your size?
Talia asked. He flushed. There's too much of it. She frowned.
There's nothing wrong with being round.
He stabbed a tomato. I'm not.
I'm round.
Well, yes, but you're a gnome. You're supposed to be round. She squinted at him.
So why can't you be?
It's not. It's a matter of health. I can't. I want to be round, Lucy announced, and then he was. One moment, he was the skinny little thing sitting in his booster seat, and the next, he began to blow up like a balloon, his chest stretching out, bones cracking obscenely. His eyes bulged from his head, and Linus was sure they were about to pop out onto the table. Look, he said through pinched lips. I'm a gnome, or Mr. Baker. Why have you never seen the ocean? Fee asked as Linus stared in horror at Lucy. It's always there. It never goes anywhere. It's too big to move. Lucy deflated, bones rearranging themselves until he was nothing but a 6-year-old boy again. It is, he agreed, as if he hadn't just blown up to 3 times his size. I tried. That was a weird day, Chauncey said, sliding a potato through his mouth with a tentacle. Linus watched as it slid down inside of him. Perfectly clear, though tinged green. It began to break down into tiny particles. So many fish died, and then you brought them back to life. Most of them. I've never had time, Linus said, feeling dizzy. Too many responsibilities. I have an important job, and Theodore attacked the meat Miss Chapelwhite had set on his plate, growling low in his throat.
Arthur says that we should always make time for the things we like,
Talia said.
If we don't, we might forget how to be happy. Are you not happy, Mr. Baker?
I'm perfectly happy. You're not happy being round, Fee said. So you can't be perfectly happy? I'm not round. What is your job, Mr. Baker? Chauncey asked, eyes bouncing on his stalks. Is it in the city? Linus wasn't hungry anymore. Yes, it's in the city. Chauncey sighed dreamily. I love the city. All those hotels that need bellhops? It sounds like paradise.
You've never been to the city,
Lucy reminded him. So, I can love something even if I've only seen pictures of it. Mr. Baker loves the ocean, and he only saw it for the first time today.
If he loves it so much, why doesn't he marry it?
Fee asked. Theodore chirped through a mouthful of meat. The children laughed. Even Sal cracked a smile. Before Linus could ask, Miss Chapelwhite said, Theodore hopes you and the ocean are very happy together. I'm not going to marry the ocean.
Ooh,
Talia said, eyes wide, mustache twitching.
Because you're already married, right?
You're married? Fee demanded. Who's your wife? Is she still in your suitcase? Why would you put her there? Is she a contortionist? Is your wife your cat? Lucy asked. I like cats, but they don't like me. His eyes started to glow red. They worry I'll eat them. To be fair, I've never had one before, so I don't know if they're delicious or not. Is your wife delicious, Mr. Baker? We don't eat pets, Lucy, Mr. Parnassus said, wiping his mouth daintily. The red faded from Lucy's eyes immediately. Right, because pets are friends, and since Mr. Baker's cat is his wife, that's like his best friend. Exactly. Mr. Parnassus said, sounding amused. No, Linus said. Not exactly. Why, I never...
I like being round,
Talia announced.
It means there's more of me to love.
I love you, Talia, Chauncey said, laying one of his eyes on her shoulder. That same eye turned slowly to look at Linus. Can you tell me more about the city? Is it bright at night because of all the lights? Linus could barely keep up. I suppose it is, but I don't like being out at night.
Because of the things in the dark that could rip your bones from your flesh?
Lucy asked through a mouthful of bread. No, Linus said, feeling queasy, because I would rather be home than anywhere else at all. That was truer now than it had ever been before. Home is where you feel like yourself, Miss Chapelwhite said, and Linus could only agree. It's the same for us, isn't it, children? Home is where we get to be who we are.
My garden is here,
Talia said. The best garden, Mr. Parnassus said. And my trees, Fee added. The most wonderful trees, Mr. Parnassus agreed. Theodore chirped, and Miss Chapelwhite stroked one of his wings. Your button, yes, it is here too. What a lovely gift, Mr. Parnassus said, smiling at the wyvern. And where else can I practice being a bellhop but at home? Chauncey asked. You have to practice something before being good at it. Practice makes perfect, Mr. Parnassus said. And this is the only place in the world where I don't have to worry about priests trying to stick a cross on my face to cast my soul back to the pits of hell, Lucy announced. He laughed as he shoved more bread in his mouth. Pesky priests, to be sure, Mr. Parnassus said. Are you going to take our home away from us? The table fell quiet. Linus blinked. He looked around for the source of the voice and was surprised to find it came from Sal. Sal, who was looking down at the table, hands curled into fists. His mouth was set into a thin line, and his shoulders were shaking. Mr. Parnassus reached out and laid his hand on one of Sal's fists. A long finger tapped the inside of Sal's wrist. He said, That isn't Mr. Baker's intention. I don't think he ever wishes for something like that to happen, not to anyone. Linus thought to disagree, but he didn't think it would do any good, especially in the light of an obviously traumatized child. And while Mr. Parnassus wasn't wrong exactly, he didn't like when someone else spoke for him. Mr. Parnassus continued, His job is to make sure I'm doing my job correctly. And what is my job? To keep us safe, the children intoned, even Sal. Precisely, Mr. Parnassus said. And I like to think I'm good at it. Because you've had practice? Chauncey asked. Mr. Parnassus smiled at him. Yes, because I've had practice, and if I have my say, you will never be separated. That was a challenge, and Linus didn't care for it one bit. I don't think it's right to... Who's ready for dessert? Miss Chapelwhite asked. The children began to cheer. Seven. Mr. Parnassus led Linus down a long hallway at the top of the stairs. The children's rooms, he said, nodding at the doors on either side of the hall. There were signs hung from each of them with the names of the children, Chauncey and Sal on the right, Fee and Talia on the left. He pointed toward a hatch in the ceiling. The outline of a wyvern had been drawn on it. Theodore's nest is up in the turret. He has a small hoard up there, but his favorite place is under the couch. I'll want to inspect them, Linus said, making a mental note of the layout. I figured you would. We could arrange for that tomorrow, seeing as how the children will be getting ready for bed shortly. Either Miss Chapelwhite can show you while the children are in their studies, or we can do it before, and then you can join us in the classroom. What about Miss Chapelwhite? Linus asked, staring at the etchings of trees in the wood of Fee's door as they passed it by. She was here long before we ever were, Mr. Parnassus said. The island is hers. We're merely borrowing it. She lives deep in the woods on the other side of the island. Linus had so many questions. This island, this house, this man. but another was more prominent, given the number of doors he'd counted. Near the end of the hall, 4 remained. One was marked as a bathroom for the girls. The other was for the boys. A third door had Arthur's office written in a legend on it. And Lucy? Where does he stay? Mr. Parnassus stopped in front of the office and nodded toward the remaining door. In my room. Linus's eyes narrowed. You share a room with a small boy? Nothing untoward, I assure you. He didn't sound offended by the implication. There was a large walk-in closet that I had converted into a room for Lucy when he came to stay with us. It's better for him if I'm near. He used to have such terrible nightmares. He still does sometimes, though they aren't as vicious as they used to be. I like to think his time here has helped. He doesn't like being far away from me, if he can help it, though I am trying to teach him independence. He's a work in progress. Mr. Parnassus opened the office door. It was smaller than Linus expected and crammed full, almost uncomfortably so. There was a desk set in the middle, surrounded by stacks of books, many of which leaned precariously. There was a single window that looked out over the ocean. It appeared endless in the night. In the distance, Linus saw the flashing wink of a lonely lighthouse. Mr. Parnassus shut the door behind them, nodding for Linus to take a seat. He did so, taking out a small notebook that he always carried in his pocket, filled with notes he kept on each of his cases. He'd been lax in his duties here so far, kept off-kilter by the very idea of this place, but that would do no longer. He'd always prided himself on the copious notes he took, and if he was to give weekly reports, as extremely upper management requested, he would make sure they were the best he'd ever written. Do you mind? He asked, pointing at a stubby pencil on the desk. Of course, Mr. Parnassus said. What's mine is yours. Something fluttered in Linus's stomach. He thought it must have been something he ate. He opened his notepad and licked the tip of the pencil, an old habit he'd never been able to break. Now, if you please, let's discuss. Sal is our newest arrival, Mr. Parnassus said, as if Linus hadn't spoken at all. He sat across from Linus in the chair behind the desk, steepling his hands under his chin. 3 months ago. Oh? I suppose I did read that in his file. He seems nervous, though I suppose teenagers often are in the face of authority. Mr. Parnassus snorted. Nervous? That's one word for it. Did you also read in his file that these 3 months are the longest he's ever stayed in one place, since he was 7 years old? No, I don't suppose I got that far. I was distracted by, well, the enormity of this assignment. Mr. Parnassus smiled sympathetically. They didn't tell you what you were walking into, did they? Extremely upper management. Not until you got here. Linus fidgeted in his seat. No, only that it was classified. Also that the children were problematic, but Linus didn't know if he should say that aloud. Surely you can see why. I can, Linus agreed. One doesn't often meet the Antichrist. Mr. Parnassus looked at him sharply. We don't use that word here. I understand that you have a job to do, Mr. Baker. But I am the master of this house, and you will abide by my rules. Is that clear? Linus nodded slowly. He hadn't expected to be rebuked so severely, especially by someone who exuded calm like the man sitting across from him. He had underestimated Mr. Parnassus. He couldn't make that mistake again. I meant no disrespect. Mr. Parnassus relaxed again. No, I don't think you did. And how could you have known? You don't know him. You don't know us. You have the files, but they only tell you the basics, I'm sure. Mr. Baker, what's written in those files are nothing but bones, and we are more than just our bones, are we not? He paused, considering. Except for Chauncey, seeing as how he doesn't actually have any bones, though my point remains the same. What is he? Linus asked, then, oh dear, that sounds rude. No offense intended, I've never seen someone like him before. I expect not, Mr. Parnassus said. He turned his head toward a stack of books to the right, eyes darting down the titles. He seemed to find the one he wanted about halfway down. He tapped the spine, forcing the edges out. The stack swayed. He pinched the cover of the book between 2 fingers and pulled quickly. the book came out. The top half of the stack fell neatly in its place. He didn't seem to notice Linus gaping at him as he opened the book on his desk and began to flip through the pages. We aren't exactly sure what Chauncey is, or even really where he came from. A mystery, though, I believe. Aha, here we go. He turned the book toward Linus and tapped on the page. Linus leaned forward. Metazoa? That's a jellyfish. Correct, Mr. Parnassus said brightly. And I think that's part of it, at least. He doesn't sting, nor does he carry any kind of poison. There's possibly some sea cucumber in there as well, though it doesn't explain his appendages. It doesn't explain anything, Linus said, feeling rather helpless. Where did he come from? Mr. Parnassus pulled the book back as he closed it. No one knows, Mr. Baker. There are mysteries that may never be solved, no matter how hard we try. And if we spend too long trying to solve them, we may miss what's right in front of us. That's not how things work in the real world, Mr. Parnassus, Linus said. Everything has an explanation. There's a reason for all things. That's the opening line of Rules and Regulations for the department in charge of magical youth. Mr. Parnassus arched an eyebrow. The world is a weird and wonderful place. Why must we try and explain it all away? For our personal satisfaction? Because knowledge is power. Mr. Parnassus snorted. Ah, power. Spoken like a true representative of Daikami. Why am I not surprised you have the rule book memorized? You should know there's a chance that you'll find Chauncey under your bed at one point or another. That startled Linus. What? Why? Because for the longest time before he came here, he was called a monster, even by people who should have known better. He was told the stories of monsters hiding under beds whose calling in life was to frighten others. He thought that was who he was supposed to be, that it was his job to scare people, because it'd been ingrained in his head that was all he was capable of. It wasn't until he came here that he realized he could be something more. So he chose to be a bellhop, Linus said numbly. He did. He saw it in a film we watched some months back, and for whatever reason, he was entranced by the idea. But he'll never be able to... Linus stopped himself before the words could come out. But Mr. Parnassus knew exactly what he was going to say. He'll never be able to be a bellhop because what hotel would ever hire one such as him? That's not... It wasn't what, exactly? Fair? Right? Just? None of those things? Linus couldn't be sure. There were reasons such laws existed, and while Linus had never understood them, not really, there was nothing he could do about that. Linus knew that people often feared, though he felt that word was coded for something else entirely, what they didn't understand. The department in charge of registration was born from the need to safeguard those who were extraordinary. At the beginning, children had been ripped from their homes and put into schools, though that was something of a misnomer. They were all but prisons, and though there were no bars on the windows, Daikami had been created as a way to placate the cries of those who protested such treatment. And when it became clear that there were many orphans, the caseworkers had been split into two groups, those who dealt with registered families in conjunction with the department in charge of registration, and those who worked with the orphans in the orphanages. No, it wasn't very fair at all. It's not, Mr. Parnassus said, agreeing with the unspoken words. But I allow him to dream of such things because he's a child, and who knows what the future will bring. Change often starts with the smallest of whispers. Like-minded people building it up to a roar. Which brings me back to Sal. Can I be blunt with you, Mr. Baker? Linus felt as if he had whiplash. I would hope for nothing less. Good, Mr. Parnassus said. You scare him. Linus blinked. Me? I don't know that I've scared anyone in my life. I highly doubt that's true. You work for Daikami, after all. And what does that have to do with... And it's not necessarily you, as in you specifically. It's what you represent. You're a caseworker, Mr. Baker. While most of the children here have a vague understanding of what that entails, Sal has first-hand experience with people exactly like you. This is his 12th orphanage. Linus felt his stomach twist. 12th? That can't be possible. He would what? Mr. Parnassus asked. Be shuttled off into one of the department-run schools that Dicamy seems to be so fond of these days? It's where the children go after you finish with them, isn't it? Linus started sweating. Oh, I don't suppose I can be sure. I do what is required of my position and nothing more. Nothing more? Mr. Parnassus echoed. How unfortunate. Have you ever been to one of the schools, Mr. Baker? Ever followed up with any of the children after you've dealt with them? That's the job of upper levels, the supervisors. I'm merely a caseworker. I highly doubt you're merely anything. Why are you a caseworker? Why have you never gone beyond this job? Because it's what I know, Linus said, a line of sweat dripping down his neck. He didn't know how the tables had gotten turned so neatly that he hadn't even noticed. He had to regain control. Aren't you curious? Linus shook his head. I can't be curious. Mr. Parnassus looked surprised. Why is that? It does me no good. Facts, Mr. Parnassus. I deal in facts. Curiosities lead to flights of fancy, and I can't afford to be distracted. I can't imagine a life lived in such a way, Mr. Parnassus said quietly. It sounds like no life lived at all. It's good, then, that I don't need your opinion on the matter, Linus snapped. I meant no offense. I'm here to ensure that this place is up to code, to review your procedures, to see if the Marcius Orphanage is following guidelines set by Dicamy to ensure the funding provided to you is being used properly, Mr. Parnassus snorted. Funding? I didn't expect you to have a sense of humor. How delightful. Linus struggled to keep in control of the conversation. Just because you house children of a more unusual variety doesn't mean I'll get distracted from the reason I'm here. It's about the children, Mr. Parnassus, and nothing more. He nodded. I can respect that. While we may be unconventional, I expect you'll see that I will do anything to keep them safe. As I said previously, the world is a weird and wonderful place, but that doesn't mean it's not without its teeth. And it will bite you when you least expect it. Linus didn't know what to do with that. You don't leave the island, or at least the children don't. How do you figure? The van out front. The tires are overgrown with weeds and flowers. Mr. Parnassus sat back in his chair again, that strange smile on his face. Very observant. Of course, it could be Fee or Talia. They do love growing things. But I suspect you wouldn't believe that. No, I wouldn't. Why does it look as if it hadn't been moved in some time? Surely you traveled through the village. Yes, with Miss Chapelwhite. He hesitated. What has she told him as they drove through Marcius? The people of Marcius don't appreciate our kind. Sprites? All magical creatures, Mr. Baker? Mr. Parnassus nodded, as if he could read Linus's thoughts. I can't say that we're unwelcome, but it's intimated that it's best for everyone if we stay where we are. Rumors tend to run rampant, and trying to get in front of them is like trying to beat back a wall of fire upon a dry field of grass. Though I expect it helps that the government pays the people of the village for their silence as to the existence of this place. It also doesn't hurt that with this stipend comes thinly veiled threats of prosecution. It's easier for everyone if we stay where we are. Fortunately, the island is bigger than it looks and provides what the children need. Miss Chapelwhite travels into the village for supplies every week or so. They know her as well as she can be known. Linus's head was swirling. He hadn't known that people were paid to keep their mouths shut, though he supposed it made a twisted sort of sense. You don't leave? Mr. Parnassus shrugged. I'm happy where I am because they're happy where they are. I suppose we could look about traveling beyond Marcius and the village, but it hasn't come up. At least not yet. I expect we'll have to deal with it one day. Linus shook his head as he picked up the notepad and pencil. Sal, he shifts into a dog? A Pomeranian, if we're being specific. And you say this has been the longest he's been in one place? Indeed. There are children who aren't classified, who aren't that different from him. I met a child who could shift into a deer. Why is he here? Mr. Parnassus eyed him warily.
Oh.
Because he can pass on his shift with a bite. Linus felt the air whoosh out of his lungs. Truly? He nodded. Yes, there was an incident at one of his previous orphanages. He was struck by a woman who worked in the kitchens for trying to take an apple. He retaliated in the only way he knew how. She underwent the change the following week. Linus thought the room was spinning. I didn't know that was possible. I thought it was genetic. I think you'll find the impossible is more accessible here than you were led to believe. And Talia? One of my first. Her family was killed rather tragically when their garden burned. Some thought it was set ablaze on purpose, though no one seemed to care much about that. Linus winced. He remembered the signs hanging from the buses, telling everyone to see something, say something. You speak Gnomish. I speak many languages, Mr. Baker. I like learning new things, and it helps bring me closer to my charges. And why is she classified? Have you ever met a female gnome, Mr. Baker? No, he hadn't. Which was odd, seeing as how he'd never even thought about it before. Linus scribbled on his notepad quickly. And then there's Fee. Mr. Parnassus chuckled. Fiercely independent she is. She's here because there has never been a sprite so young with so much power. When they tried to rescue her from a most dire situation, she managed to turn 3 men into trees. Another, much older sprite was able to turn them back. Eventually. Fortunately for me, Miss Chapelwhite assists her in ways I cannot. She's taken her under her wing, both figuratively and literally. She's blossomed quite beautifully under Miss Chapelwhite's tutelage. We're very lucky she offered to assist us. And why did she? Linus asked. This is her island. Sprites are fiercely territorial. Why did she allow you here at all? Mr. Parnassus shrugged again. The greater good, I suppose? He spoke just like a sprite, in vague little circles. Linus didn't appreciate it. And what would that be? To see children who aren't wanted by anyone be allowed to prosper. You know as well as I do that the term orphanage is a misnomer, Mr. Baker. No one comes here looking to adopt. No, he supposed they didn't, seeing as how the Marcius orphanage was hidden from most everyone. But did that really matter? Had he known any of the children in an orphanage such as this to be adopted? He couldn't think of a single instance. How had he never noticed that before? Theodore? Isn't this all in your files, Mr. Baker? No, it wasn't. In fact, Linus thought Mr. Parnassus had been correct when he'd said they were nothing but bones. It's best I hear it directly from the source. Nuances can be missed when they are merely words on paper. He's not just an animal, Mr. Parnassus said. I never said he was. He sighed. No, I don't suppose you did. Forgive me. I've dealt with people like you before. I forget that you're not all the same, even though I don't know quite what to make of you yet. Linus felt strangely bare. What you see is what you get with me. This is all I am. Oh, I doubt that immensely, he said. Theodore is special. I know you know just how rare someone like him is. Yes. He's still a juvenile, though his precise age is unknown. He thinks differently than the rest of us, and though we understand each other, it's more in abstract thought rather than specifics. Does that make sense? Not in the slightest, Linus admitted. You'll see, Mr. Parnassus said. You're here for an entire month, after all, and I believe that leaves one child left, though I think you did that on purpose. Miss Chapelwhite says she found you fainted dead away at the mere thought. Linus flushed as he cleared his throat. It was unexpected. That's a good word to use to describe Lucy, I'm sure. Is he... Linus hesitated. Then, is it true? Is he the actual the son of the devil? I believe he is, Mr. Parnassus said, and Linus's breath caught in his throat. Though the notion of what someone like him is supposed to be is more fiction than fact. If that's true, then he's supposed to bring about the end of days, Linus exclaimed. He's 6 years old. He proclaimed himself to be hellfire and darkness when he threatened me, Mr. Parnassus chuckled. It was his way of saying hello. He's got a morbid sense of humor for one so young. It's endearing once you get used to it. Linus gaped at him. Mr. Parnassus sighed as he leaned forward. Look, Mr. Baker, I know it's a lot to swallow, but I've had Lucy for a year. There were plans to, well, let's just say this was a last resort. Regardless of his parentage, he is a child. And I refuse to believe that a person's path is set in stone. A person is more than where they come from, than the sum of their parts. Mr. Parnassus nodded. Yes, exactly. Lucy might cause fear in the majority of the world, but he doesn't cause it in me. I've seen what he is capable of. Behind the eyes and the demon in his soul, he is charming and witty and terribly smart. I will fight for him as I would for any of my children. That didn't sit right with Linus. But they're not yours. You're the master of the house, not their father. They are your charges. Mr. Parnassus smiled tightly. Of course. A slip of the tongue. It's been a long day. And I expect tomorrow will bring much of the same. It's worth it, though. Is it? Of course. I couldn't see myself doing anything different. Can you? We're not here to talk about me, Mr. Parnassus, Linus pointed out. He spread his hands. And why is that? You seem to know everything about us, and anything you don't know can be read in what I'm sure is a meticulous file. Not everything, Linus said, closing his notebook. For example, there doesn't seem to be much information about you. In fact, your file was rather thin. Why is that? Mr. Parnassus looked amused again, and Linus wondered what he was missing. Shouldn't that be a question for extremely upper management? They're the ones who sent you here. He was right, of course. It was disconcerting how little information there was. Mr. Arthur Parnassus's file told him nothing more than his age and education. There'd been an odd statement at the end. Mr. Parnassus will be exemplary for the more problematic of children given his capabilities. Linus hadn't known what to make of that, and now, seeing him face to face only left him with more questions. I have a feeling they won't tell me much more than they already have. In that, I suspect you'd be right. Linus stood. I expect full transparency and your cooperation in this investigation. Mr. Parnassus laughed. What happened to this being a visit? That was your word, sir, not mine. We both know what this is. The only reason Dikey would have sent me here was if there was cause for concern. And I can see why. You have a powder keg under your roof, one more powerful than should ever exist. And he should be found at fault for existing? What choice did he have in the matter? That felt like a discussion for when Linus had his wits about him. Or possibly never. The implications alone made him feel faint again. I am here to see if further action should be taken. Further action, Mr. Parnassus said, frustration slipping into his voice for the first time. They have no one, Mr. Baker. No one but me. Do you really think Dykemy would allow someone like Lucy in one of their schools? Think hard before you answer. That's neither here nor there, Linus said stiffly. Mr. Parnassus looked toward the ceiling. Of course it's not. Because that's what happens after you're done. And that's none of your concern. He shook his head. If you only knew. If there isn't anything amiss, then you have nothing to worry about, Linus said. You may think me callous, Mr. Parnassus, but I assure you I do care. I wouldn't be in this position if I didn't. I believe that you believe that. He looked at Linus again. My apologies, Mr. Baker. Yes, you will do your job one way or another. But I think if you open your eyes, you'll see what's right in front of you, rather than what's listed in a file. Linus's skin felt like it was crawling. He needed to get out of this office. It seemed as if the walls were closing in. Thank you for your hospitality, even if you didn't have a choice. I'm going to retire for the night. It's been a rather eventful day, and I expect more of the same tomorrow. He turned and opened the door. Before he shut it behind him, he heard, Good night, Mr. Baker. Calliope was waiting inside the door when he arrived back at the guest house. He hadn't come across anyone else since leaving the office, though he heard voices echoing around him behind closed doors. He forced himself not to run out the front door. Calliope spared him a glance before walking through the open door to do her business. The air was cold, and while he waited, he stared up at the main house. Lights shone through the second-floor windows, and he thought he saw movement behind closed curtains. If he remembered the layout of the upper floor correctly, it would be Sal's room he was seeing. 12 different orphanages, he muttered to himself. Something like that should have been in his file. Why on earth would he not have been enrolled in a school? Calliope came back inside, purring as she rubbed against his legs. He closed the door and locked it for good measure. Though he figured if someone wanted to get in, they could. Back in the bedroom, he remembered the warning from Mr. Parnassus about how Chauncey liked to hide under beds to scare people. He couldn't quite see the dark space underneath, as it was hidden by the quilt that hung nearly to the floor. He scrubbed a hand over his face. I'm overthinking things. Of course he's not there, that's ridiculous. He turned to go to the bathroom to perform his nightly routine. He was in the middle of brushing his teeth, toothpaste in a glob on his generous chin, when he turned and marched back to the room. He fell to his knees, lifted up the quilt, and peered under the bed. No monsters, children or otherwise, were hidden underneath. There, he said through a mouthful of toothpaste. See, it's fine. He almost believed it. By the time he donned his pajamas and crawled into bed, he was sure he was going to toss and turn for the remainder of the night. He didn't sleep well in strange places, and learning everything he had today wouldn't help. He tried to read rules and regulations because, no matter what Mr. Parnassus said, he absolutely did not have it memorized. But he found himself thinking of dark eyes above a quiet smile, and then there was nothing but white.